So it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Roshan Danesh is a lawyer, a conflict resolution innovator and educator, whose areas of work, teaching, and writing include conflict resolution, peace building, constitutional law, Indigenous rights, interethnic and interreligious dialogue, and organizational dynamics and cohesion. Roshan is a lifelong member of the Baha'i Faith and completed his doctoral studies at Harvard Law School and has taught at academic institutions around the world. In conjunction with his teaching work, Roshan has also worked extensively as a consultant to numerous international organizations, corporations, governments, and schools. He has also worked extensively with First Nations governments in Canada on the advancement and protection of constitutional rights, design and implementation of negotiation and reconciliation processes, governance and strategic development and dispute resolution. So could you please welcome our speaker, Dr. Roshan Danesh.
Great. Thank you for the introduction and everyone spending a few minutes tonight talking about this really critical and important topic. I just want to acknowledge just at the outset that we're on the traditional lands of the Esquimalt and Songhees peoples, and thank them for allowing us to have this evening together tonight. As was said, I've, for about 15 years now, been working extensively with Indigenous communities, learning from them, listening, seeing how they've been carrying forward this struggle for justice, for affirmation of title and rights, for reconciliation. And, just in giving talks like this, as I do all over quite frequently, it's really remarkable just how quickly things are accelerating, how quickly things are changing. I think a year ago I was asked to give a similar talk right here, and a very different context occurs even today from 12 months ago when we talk about this theme. I mean, even whether we're talking in the political scene and what's happened federally, if we're talking locally, if we're just talking about the numbers of people who come to community gatherings to talk about these issues, I've noticed radical changes over a number of years. That's not to say that we're not in midst of some tremendous work that we have to do together, but it's important to acknowledge how rapidly this theme is coming to the forefront of our minds and hearts as communities and societies and peoples. And it's a very complex topic. And I think there's probably numerous people that I can see here who could speak to it probably far more beautifully and eloquently than I can. But I thought I would really just share, and I don't know how long I'll speak, and if I'm going too long, just cut me off and we can do whatever we wish. But I thought I'd really just share or organize the few remarks around four stories, around stories or themes, we'll see how they go, that each of which I think touches on a different aspect of what reconciliation entails, of what really coming to terms with the injustices and moving towards justice requires. And so each of these four little snapshots is meant to exemplify a different aspect of it. And the first story, in typically narcissistic fashion, is about me. And it's very simple. It's nothing other than to reflect on the fact, like I think many of us in this room, I grew up in Ottawa, in the shadow of the Parliament buildings, going to probably the best private school, or one of the best private schools in Canada, where all the Prime Minister's kids, including our current Prime Minister, attended for a period of time. And in all my years of education in that environment, I, of course, similar to what our current Prime Minister remarked not long ago, never learned one thing about Indigenous peoples. Never even came across any reference in history books or geography class other than to say, well, this tribe allied with the French to help fight the English, or this, as an appendage to the colonial wars, European wars that were going on in Canada. Other than that, I learned nothing. I knew nothing. I heard nothing. I experienced nothing. If I met an Indigenous person in the first 20 years of my life, I don't remember it. I wasn't aware of it. I wasn't conscious of it. I have absolutely no recollection of it. And the reason you're probably wondering why am I at a talk on Indigenous issues from somebody who knows clearly nothing about it and never experienced anything, but we'll get there hopefully. But I emphasize that because it's not just the fact that I might have had lousy teachers or uncaring teachers. That absence in my education, that out of sight, out of mind, right, out of consciousness reality is not just a happenstance thing of where I was at that time, 30 years ago in Ottawa. It wasn't just because of the context I was in. That out of sight, out of mind, out of history, out of the course of human affairs reality is a reflection of core fundamental myths which actually are at the heart of the birth of Canada. That experience I had was because of a narrative and a set of beliefs that have been permeated the Canadian story about itself. And to give a very simple expression of this, of the root of this, is a term that's often used. It's called the doctrine of discovery, which is a term that has roots in the papacy in the 1500s and so on. But it was the notion that any land that didn't have Christian subjects didn't really have human beings living there. There was no human society. There was no civilization. There was no culture. There was no human affairs. And these lands then could be discovered, and then the land itself would be taken by the sovereign who discovered it, England, France, whatever, who discovered it, and off you went, right? It was barren places. It was, in the legal term, terra nullius, empty space, right? That is the founding myth of Canada. It is a founding notion that has been deeply ingrained in how Canada has thought itself, that there were no human peoples living here. And so that absence of being subjects of history, of being agents of human reality and organization, of the complex societies that Indigenous peoples built in the narrative of Canada. It's a legal narrative, it's a political narrative, it's a social narrative. There was nothing. It was empty. There was nothing to talk about. The fact that I learned nothing, the fact that Justin Trudeau got up at the Truth and Reconciliation said he never learned anything. It's not just because we had the same crappy teachers, right? It is a reflection of a pattern and a myth that has been propounded generation after generation, right? My daughter, who's here, and other young people are here, they learn very differently. But even now, right? It's only this year, for example, that curriculums are being rewritten to include, for example, the residential school experience. And so, this reality really came home to me when I was, I'm a little later in my life now, and I was sent up to Iqaluit in Nunavut to teach for UVic, to help teach the first Inuit lawyers. This is around 2000, 2001. and I was teaching constitutional law to a group of 13 Inuit, 11 women and 2 men who were to become the first. There had never been any Inuit lawyers in Canadian history. And I went up there and I was teaching constitutional law to these 13 Inuit, I call them students, they were all older than me, but students and much more learned than I was. And there was this exchange that occurred in the classroom that sort of brings this whole reality home to me, brought it home to me at that time, which was I won't name him, but one of the most famous thinkers on the planet, an old male of European descent, but if I said his name, you would know who I was talking about. Extremely famous philosopher, political thinker, social activist, elderly man, came to Iqaluit at the same time that I was there, and he asked if he could come speak in my class. And I said, of course, come. And the theme was about justice and the struggle for justice for Inuit people, something which he didn't know a lot about, but he knew about political processes generally. And there's an exchange that happened in this class between him and one of these students. He gave a talk for about 45 minutes, about whatever, about how the struggle for justice is about, developing new democratic institutions and liberal processes and so forth and so on. And, he spoke and very polite and no one interrupted him. And then he finished and all these students, I see them, they're all looking at each other, deciding who's going to respond. And then a woman gets up. She was the eldest of the students and sort of an elder in the class. And this is what she said to him. She said, and I'll never forget this, she said, "There's 5 generations living inside of me. There's my grandmother who lived on the land and never saw," I think she said white person, a European, never saw anybody from another culture. There's my mother who was forced off the land and forced to live in settlements and start changing her way of life. There was me who was taken away from my parents and put in residential school. There's my children who play video games and watch television and know almost nothing of the Inuit way of life. And there's my unborn grandchildren who will probably know nothing of the life of my grandmother. And he had no clue what she was talking about. Like, this was not successful communication, right? But the point is that chasm, right? That chasm in experience, right? Of experience of life, that chasm in ways of understanding, that chasm in ways of thinking, right? She was expressing, he was expressing the struggle in the way we often talk about it, about institutions and structures and economies. She was talking about identity and culture and history and way of life and interconnection and family and tradition and how knowledge is passed down. And these vastly different experiences, these vastly different ways of thinking about this challenge, this situation of how to approach it. The fact that in this country we have such a chasm of knowledge and experience, such a different set of perceptions and understandings. And there was, that is the challenge before us, right? When I started working in this work intensely, 2003, 2004, I didn't open a newspaper every day and have 12 stories about Indigenous reconciliation, there was nothing. There was a little bit here, a little bit there. Now, you can't open a newspaper any day. You can't watch the news without it being. We are just at the moment when acceleration of discourse and knowledge in a much broader arena of society is taking place. But I tell that story because it also highlighted one other critical issue for me. Right? She told the story about her grandmother being moved off the land and so forth and so on. And me being a lawyer and so forth, it made me think about this issue of the land, and it made me ask a question to myself. How did the land ever transfer from her grandmother to anyone else? And, I've worked in other parts of the world, where There's two ways that we think of land transferring. A people could be conquered in war, and that could be part of the outcome of that, and that's a very brutal way. That's not what happened in Canada. Or we sign lots of papers and pass deeds and, pay money or something, and that's how it happens. Well, here in British Columbia, right, what's the answer to that question? Right? I'll answer it later on. So it brought that question to mind also, and I want you to just hold that question in your mind. How did the land ever this land actually is slightly different, but I'll talk about that later. But how did the land ever transfer? Right? So that's the first little story, which is, about my own ignorance, but I use it to, this element of reconciliation is this journey from ignorance and ignorance of each other to some deep knowledge and understanding, and how do we get there? That's the pathway we have to take. It's a very difficult pathway. And that sort of jumps into my second story, which is more about racism and the response to it. Because all of you have probably heard, in the last number of months, how many media outlets are closing their comment sections. Have you heard this? Like CBC, on their social media. So CBC a few weeks ago, I just think, or maybe a month ago, had to stop any commenting on any story about Aboriginal anything. Because all that happens is racist comments after racist comments. They're not the first to do this. They're actually a little late. It's been happening quite a bit. And it's because for a significant period of time, there's really been only as, racial denigration, racial comments, ethnic comments, comments related to the identity of another group have become increasingly and properly taboo in society. In Canada, nonetheless, we have continued to tolerate racist rhetoric about Indigenous peoples at far higher levels. And it is something that we're grappling to share with you two stories about this, both local. One was in Nanaimo a couple years ago, and I see a few people here who were there as part of this. There was the main newspaper in Nanaimo, the Times Colonist of Nanaimo, published a letter from somebody. I won't repeat the letter because it has a lot of upsetting commentary in it. But to give you a flavor of it, one of the sentence, I think the opening sentence of the letter said, the only thing Indigenous people are notable for is their history of complete underachievement. I think that was the opening line, something like that. So this letter, it goes on, it was a long letter. I can't remember the detail. It was how long it was. It was probably a full page printed. And so this was published, starts all sorts of outrage in response, but it was not one of years of letters like this that had been allowed to be published. I'll talk about the response to it a second. Second example is here in Victoria, another media outlet. This is maybe a year ago. I won't name which newspaper, but it has the word colonist in the title, and which is unfortunate. I understand they're debating changing the name. That's what the editors told me. And it was a cartoon. And it was a cartoon that's hard to describe. I guess I could have brought slides, but who wants to look at racist cartoons anyway? But it was a cartoon, and it in effect, it made how I opened tonight about the traditional lands of Esquimalt and Songhees. It basically made fun of doing that. It made fun of that acknowledgement. And, it can be interpreted in various ways, but it sparked a real outrage and pushback. And the racism is not what it's not what I'm interested in. It's the response to it, to both of these incidents. In Nanaimo, the response to that incident, at first it was responded with outrage. There were demonstrations. I don't know, Bill, how many people showed up outside? 300 people maybe at a demonstration out front. And, there was big, powerful response. that gave away very quickly to all sorts of the local First Nations and leaders and national First Nations leaders and provincial First Nations leaders and local community groups and the university and city hall and coming together, and a decision was made to have a series, a rounds of public dialogue and events to dialogue about this. And the main one was an event, on a night like this, at the Vancouver Island Conference Center. 400 people came, and everyone sat in a massive rounds of circles. It went on for, I don't know, I was chairing it. It felt like it went on for 5 days, but it went on for 5 hours maybe, 3-4 hours. Everyone had a talk, but the interesting thing about the response is that the theme of the dialogue, the message that opened from the Indigenous leaders, the message and theme that was discussed the whole evening was about love. That this challenge of reconciliation is about learning to love one another. It's not about learning to tolerate one another. It's not learning about how to just live side by side. It's not about just learning to accept our differences. It's about learning to love. And one of the statements that was made that night, I'll just read it to you because I pulled it up. It said, at its core, reconciliation demands a new mindset and orientation to ourselves, each other, and the relationships we forge between us. It is rooted in the firm recognition that we must forge bonds of unity amongst us that recognize, respect, and build upon our diversity. Reconciliation demands that we move far beyond merely learning to tolerate one another, but rather cultivate true altruistic love in our hearts and minds for each other. It goes on and on. That's a remarkable response to, and there were even, of course, as you would expect, there were racist events that night as well in the hallways outside the event. But the message, right, the response, what is this theme of love that comes out of it? Same thing with the cartoon incident. A little different. It wasn't a big public gathering. But a number of Indigenous leaders from across the province, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, who's very famous, and Chief Doug White from Up Island, and Chief Don Tom from the Saanich Peninsula, and members of the First, they all came, and we all went together to meet with the editors of the Times Colonist. Of the paper with colonist in the title. And my fault. Just put it out of your mind. And I mean, it started as, I was there, it was Indigenous leaders, I was the only non-Indigenous with them that went in. And the editors were there. And, I'm just being truthful, it was 6 50-plus white men. And a young reporter, a young woman as well. But the editors were 6 white men. And, here we are, it was a difficult opening to the thing. But a dialogue took place. Everyone went around, in particular the Indigenous leaders, talking about the harmful effects of this kind of rhetoric on children, on young people, on reinforcing patterns, on identity, on self-respect. And it became, as you might have expected, a very powerful, transformative kind of experience, by the editors and so forth. A lot of, feelings coming out, a lot of expressions of the lack of understanding and needing to learn, and, a very positive outcome all around. But it was, again, all around this theme of deep mutuality, deep understanding needing to come out of it. That this is really about a shift, right? That we have to go all the way from the hundreds of racist comments that are posted under any story. We have to flip all the way to truly learning to love one another in new ways. And why that's so important is this theme of mutuality has always been there in the history of Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations in this country in various ways. It has been, submerged under all sorts of other patterns of oppression and injustice and so forth. But there is also a history of this mutuality. And, there's a lot of research now and writing about how, early patterns of interdependence, we can see them here and there, and patterns of sharing. And you can go read, for example, John Ralston Saul's book, where he's trying to just, talk about this history of interdependence in the early years, and that there was a turn away from it. But, there's indigenous voices that express this too. So, for example, a number of nations here in British Columbia, particularly in the interior, in the southern interior, have recounted their own history of experience in the early 1900s. And it was a story of how we started when the settlers first came. We started with a pattern of learning about each other and trying to find ways to share, and we were trying to find a mutual pattern, and then expressing over in very lengthy discourse about how something turned against that pattern, right? And then things started to change to the pattern that we're more familiar with in terms of the patterns of injustice. Just to read you a short statement from that history told by the tribes in the interior, describing that early period. They say, these people, they're talking about those who came, wish to be partners with us in our country. We must therefore be the same as brothers to them and live as one family. We will share everything. We will share equally in everything, half and half, in land, water, timber. What is ours will be theirs, and what is theirs will be ours. We will help each other to be good and great. It's beautiful, eh? It's from 1911, from the interior tribes, right? But they were saying that because they had seen some of that pattern. They were describing pre-Confederation, right? Some of the early experience. That there were negative things they said as well. But they said this mutuality and this desire for that pattern of mutuality was there there's that strand that was there. And then they go on to say how that, for some reason, disappeared. The whole notion of treaty, of course, right, is in legal terms, but a treaty is also an expression of that, right? It's two sovereign peoples coming together and saying, we're going to sort out our relationship as equals in this way, and define our ways of relating and living and working together in this way. So we live here, right? Do many of you know that you live here in the one place in British Columbia where there's treaties? Did you know that? Many of you? Yes? Good. Right? So there was here in the 1850s, Fort Victoria, and Governor Douglas, the first governor, he came and he was sitting around here and he says, well, I know more people are going to come from England, and there's people already here, and we need land, and I need access to the coal, and I need access to some timber, and I don't know if I'm allowed to take it or not. So he wrote home, which took a while back then, I guess, and he got an answer back some years later. And the answer back is you have to go enter into treaties. You have to go and reach arrangements that will allow access of that. So he started doing that, and he started around here first, Saanich Peninsula. The tribes we talk about on the peninsula, Tsilhqot'in and Sekum and Sayout and Sartlip and Malahat, they were in a treaty together, right? The Saanich Treaty. And then he starts moving, a little bit on the west coast, and he starts moving up the island, and you have treaties at Snuneymuxw and Snuneymuxw, and then you go further to the north, and you have some treaties up in the Quaguth area in the north of Campbell River area. And in all, you have about 14 nations entering into treaties. And you're going to get wildly different of course, understandings. You have, the way indigenous people understood what these treaties were versus what the Crown understood they were. The fact that, they were really oral treaties. The documents of them were appended to them later after the treaty was entered into. It's copied from a treaty in New Zealand. It had nothing to do with what people talked about here. But it was all about, right, that the notion, the impulse was that there had to be some mutuality, some entering into an arrangement. And he did that for a few years. Then Canada was formed, and then British Columbia joined Confederation, and it all stopped. And it went into moving Indigenous people onto reserves, taking away the land. Any dialogue about that stopped. And it's amazing, the story of what happened here, because you all knew there were treaties, but until 1960, from basically 1860 till 1960, you will not find any reference to those treaties in any colonial book, in any Canadian archive. They were forgotten to time. They were completely ignored. Nobody in the Canadian state knew they existed. In 1960, it was illegal for Indigenous people to raise issues. In 1920, because of what was happening in terms of that shift from treaty making to pushing people off the land, taking the land, disrupting the life, Indigenous leaders went to Ottawa to a Senate hearing, to community, to a Senate committee, most of the leaders being from out in BC, and they said, you have to stop this. And they made a powerful presentation and a plea to stop what was going on. And the response of the Canadian state was to pass a law saying it was a crime ever to raise those issues again. So the Indian Act was amended in 1921, saying it was a crime for an Aboriginal person to raise issues about rights or the land. And it was a crime for a lawyer to say anything about it. And it was a crime to hire a lawyer to say it for you. And that stayed in place until 1957. And then the Indian Act was changed. So this was the response to that change and that shift and that plea for justice. And then in 1960, the first case reaches court, and it was from a nation, we have members of that nation here in this room, relatives of those who brought the case are here tonight. And it was a hunting case, and they were arrested. Two members of the Snuneymuxw and Snuneymuxw were arrested for hunting, and they get up in court in front of a judge, and the judge says, what do you have to say for yourself? You were hunting out of season, you're not allowed to hunt that way. And they said, we have a treaty. And the judge said, what the hell are you talking about, right? And he threw them out. He said, there's no treaties, get out of here. And the story goes, right, it was totally forgotten to time. There was no knowledge that there was any treaty whatsoever, except the Indigenous peoples had maintained the knowledge of it and the belief in it, right? That it expressed a mutual arrangement that needed to be honored. And that was so much so, just to show you what happened then, as the case went forward, the most famous anthropologist in Canada at the time, who was also the anthropologist, Canada, the legislature used to have an official anthropologist of British Columbia, an official historian and anthropologist. He was asked, he said, there's no treaties. He went to the archives, across the street there, and started pouring through them and searched and searched and searched, and guess what he found? He found the treaties. That's how they came back into the consciousness of Canada. They were in the consciousness of the Indigenous people who had entered into them all of that time. The reason I emphasize this theme around mutuality, I started with love, racism, and then mutuality, is that that is what reconciliation is at its heart, right? It is building deep patterns of understanding and relating and living together, right? But we have this problem, right? Because we have turned our back on that for 100 years. right? We do not know how to do it between these different groupings of people, right? We don't know how to relate in that way. If we had followed through, right, with those early work on mutuality, we would be in a much better place of knowing how to live together, of knowing how to work together. I mean, think about your relationships in your own life, right? How complicated it is to build real, enduring, loving, sacrificial, creative, exciting, constructive relationships, right? Think about how hard it is. Well, that's what you have to do between peoples as a society. But we have 100 years, there were some elements we could have built on to do that, but we have totally shut out, right? And we don't have the infrastructure of knowing how to do that with each other. And think about how more complex it is to do today than it would have been to do 150 years ago. We live on top of each other now, right? Right? We're now in a situation where the same piece of land has multiple claims to it. All, like it's so complicated in any way you think about it, right? It permeates all aspects of society, right? If you want to talk about dealing with poverty, if you want to talk about the healthcare system getting stronger, if you want to talk about educational dynamics, if you want to talk about the strength of the economy, any of these issues require dealing with that reality between these different groups of people. So, I'll end this second story. I'm talking too long, so I'll speed up. But I'll end this second story to show you how complex it is, I'll end it with another incident that occurred in the summer, which is a nation on the coast, on the Sunshine Coast, had completed a negotiation of a simple agreement that had to do with, the fact that hundreds of marinas and docks had been built on a village site and destroyed their fisheries. And after many years of effort by them, they had reached a settlement with the province. And it was a new plan would be put in for the future to steward the area and rehabilitate some of the environment and the fisheries and so forth. And the province said they needed to share this with the public at large because it affects some of the people's land holdings. So it went out to the public, and you might have seen this in the newspapers. Some public meetings were held. 400 people came. They wouldn't allow the greeting of the territory to take place. They shut down the elder who was trying to say a prayer and booed over him. They basically ran the people out. Racist signs were put up all over the Sunshine Coast. It just flew out of control, right? That's still going on right now. I was in meetings about it last week with government ministers. It's still going on. That is, right, the complexity that we have now. The lack of a building on the little grains of mutuality that we could have put us in it, and the lack of knowledge of each other really put us in this very dire situation today. So that's the second story. I'll speed up with the next two. The third story is about the Tsilhqot'in people, and I choose the Tsilhqot'in people because they're ever present now in the media and the news and the history of this moment in time, because in June 2014, the Supreme Court of Canada rendered a decision that is the most important decision. Probably many experts say anywhere in the world on Indigenous rights. And really, in the Canadian context, it is after that law was changed in 1957 and you were allowed to talk about these issues again. There's, one of the avenues Indigenous peoples have used, as you know, to really try to transform the way things were occurring was the courts. And the Tsilhqot'in, while the courts are going to continue to be used, Tsilhqot'in decision is really the last fundamental piece of the architecture of how Canada, at least legally, is going to try to respond to this issue. And it's important because it really is a moment in time that really says things need to move out of the court now and move into halls like this and homes and neighborhoods and start to be dealt with in a real way. So just to say quickly a bit about the Tsilhqot'in decision. The Tsilhqot'in decision answers that question. How did the land transfer? Right? That question I had from 15 years ago. And the answer was it never did. Right? Here in British Columbia, it never did transfer. Nobody ever agreed to transfer it. I mean, the little bit of treaties maybe did agree to transfer some, but that's just over tiny areas, small areas of the province. Fundamentally, the answer to the question is the land can only transfer in a lawful way, by agreement, and if there isn't, it didn't. That's the basic reality. So the Tsilhqot'in people, the way they got to that point, the case started 25 years ago. It started 25 years ago when the province issued, like they frequently do, some forest permits in a very pristine area of the middle part of British Columbia in Tsilhqot'in territory, sort of west of Williams Lake. And the Tsilhqot'in people didn't want trees to be cut down in that area. These trees had sacred and cultural and economic and social purposes for them. And they stopped that cutting from occurring. This is in the 1980s. That led to 25 years in court, $150 million the court case cost for the three sides, federal, provincial, and the Tsilhqot'in, all paid by the Canadian taxpayer, by the way, in case you were interested. And there's many cases like that. And the issue in the case, just to get underneath that the land never transferred lawfully was, is Aboriginal title exist over large areas or small areas? And if it does exist, what does it mean when it exists? And the answers to that question were, it exists over very large areas. In that case, it was 2,000 square kilometers of the province. And what does it mean? It means that the entire benefit of the land is the First Nations. That's what it means. This was very far-reaching, right? It was a complete victory for the First Nation. And it's a real credit, right? 25 years of a small community, like the Tsilhqot'in people, you may not know, were in the early history of interaction with Europeans and settlers, were one of the most militant and strong nations in the interior of British Columbia. In Canada, unlike the United States, we didn't have really wars, right? In the United States, the Indian Wars and so forth that occurred between the state. In British Columbia, the one place where war was on the cusp was in the Tsilhqot'in. And there were some skirmishes, there were deaths, there was some fighting, and in a particular incident, the Tsilhqot'in leadership was sort of duped coming to a peace meeting and then all hanged. An event that Christy Clark went up and apologized for last year. And then the Tsilhqot'in people were, like many First Nations, were particularly decimated by smallpox and disease. And I've heard different numbers, but from the Tsilhqot'in themselves, they really down to about 5% of what they were in terms of numbers. They're going up now. But by the early 1900s, they had been reduced in numbers, in population to that size. So these people, like the resilience and strength to carry forward, this case from the 1980s for 25 years, is really a remarkable accomplishment. But what's so significant about the Tsilhqot'in decision, and I'm sure you've read certain things about it in the newspaper, is not, those legal niceties, but the fact that effectively what the court is saying, what Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin is saying in this case, and if you are lawyers and know the law well, you can see this. They're basically saying, for God's sake, get on with this, right? They're basically making it impossible to stay in the space that we're staying in now, because the courts cannot accomplish reconciliation. They are genetically wired not to accomplish reconciliation. If you asked 100 people anywhere in the world, and the question was, we need to achieve reconciliation, who should we talk to? Lawyers would be the last people on the list, right? It is an adversarial venue that has played its role, like in civil rights movements in the United States and in other societies. It has its moment in time, and Indigenous people have used it remarkably and will continue to do so. But the message of the case, and the message you see from politicians now more and more, and from social activists and from people on the ground dealing with how people are relating and everything, is the challenge has to move, and it can only be addressed in how we're relating with each other, how we're organizing our communities, how we're organizing our societies, how we're interacting with each other, the kinds of social structures we're putting into place. That is the challenge. And quite purposely, the court is creating such a far-reaching decision to make it extremely difficult to not move, right? I mean, you may or may not have noticed, but in the last year and a half, the economic agenda, for example, of the province has gone into chaos, right? Right? Whether it's Site C, whether it's LNG, whether it's mining in the interior, you're seeing it stopped or delayed or unable to move on in every way. That's the more competitive side of it, adversarial side of it. But it's the outcome of the reality that the courts have done what they can do, and now it's up to us. It is up to people to begin to relate and move forward in new ways, right? And really take the handle of this issue. And that's what, dialogues like this and everything else has to be a part of that. And, because I'm talking too long, I'll just leave that and go on to the fourth story and the last point I really wanted to make, which is about culture and cultural genocide, which is a term that you've heard quite a bit of over the last number of years in relation to residential school. And I use that term quite consciously, cultural genocide, which means basically trying to dissociate or annihilate people from their identity and culture, annihilate another group's identity or culture, stop the expression, cultural expression of a group, right? These are all forms of cultural genocide. And cultural genocide attempts at it always target three things. It targets, and look, we could talk about genocide also, we could talk about crimes against humanity also, but I just want to actually focus on the cultural aspect. It always targets three things. It targets children, number one. And why does it target children? Because it wants to break the transmission of knowledge and culture and way of life, right? It wants to cut it off, right? And cease it, right? And ensure it can't be passed on from one to the next, right? So you always want to attack the younger generation. So obviously the residential schools, for example, which, had as its clear agenda to take the Indian out of the Indian, that's a quote, was part of that. So the first thing, cultural genocide, if you're going to try to do it, it attacks children. The second thing is that cultural genocide always attacks ceremony. It wants to attack those events that create social cohesion, cultural awareness, right? Cultural celebration, group identity, group affiliation, right? So you end up, we often, so you ban ceremony, right? You ban gathering, right? You ban celebration. So here in BC, the potlatch and so forth are banned because you want to stop that type of event happening. The third thing that cultural genocide attacks is memory. Symbol, memory, the things that mark a place or a space that remind us of whose it is and of a cultural association to it, right? Of a relationship to it that's different, right? No clearer example than this than how we treat Indigenous resting places, grave sites, right? We're building a road, come across some grave sites. I have to ask you, if it wasn't an Indigenous grave site, right? We would freak out if we were digging up a graveyard of any other group of people except Indigenous people, right? Routinely, it's just steamroll ahead, right? Or move it, right? Like the different level of respect, relationship shown to Indigenous resting places than non-Indigenous is remarkable, right? Right, and that's right. Those resting places are part of that memory, right? If they're there and we acknowledge them, right, it is part of that culture permeating our consciousness and carrying on. Our ability to move right through them demonstrates, right, that lack of connection and affiliation with it. So, and it's changing a bit now, like the Grace Islet thing down on the Saanich Peninsula, like the pushback against that, but still even our legal structures allow far more desecration of Indigenous. In fact, under the laws, Indigenous grave sites aren't part of they're not caught by the Gravesite Act, right? They're dealt with somewhere else, right? Treated differently. So, Canada, right? Our history is permeated with this attempt at cultural genocide. It failed. Tremendous harm was done, but it failed. And it failed because of how Indigenous people pushed back on this. And there's many, many things I could say about it and others here could say about it, but I'm just going to talk about two people, which will remain nameless, to illustrate how they've pushed back on that. And there's thousands I could talk about and many others, but I just shared two. One young man, same age as me, from a nation on the coast. He grew up in a quite abusive household. And by a young age, 13, 14, ended up living on the downtown east side in Vancouver, was in gangs. Very difficult. He ended up over here on the island. His life went on another trajectory. He decided to become a lawyer. Accomplished that because he wanted to fight for Aboriginal rights. Did that for a number of years. Decided that wasn't enough. He was a very talented artist. So he started a company producing artwork, grew into having 20, 30 staff, all Indigenous, decided that wasn't enough because he realized, one of maybe the number one, I'm not sure the exact numbers now, source of income for Indigenous individuals in communities is often around artwork. And the cultural genocide, the impact of that, it continues in that Indigenous artwork is, of course, completely appropriated, right, with almost no benefit to the actual producers, the artists, and the communities who create it, right? The most common pattern is an artist, an Indigenous artist might create something, might get a small amount of money for it if it isn't stolen altogether, and the design is reproduced and mass-produced in China, typically, with no benefit whatsoever. So the Olympics, for example, which was plastered with Indigenous artwork everywhere, was all mass-produced in China with almost no benefit to the Indigenous communities or people. So this individual decided that was wrong. So he then developed a system for authentic, it's called Indigenous Authentic, and it tags artwork, and it has different levels into it to, has it been produced, is it truly an Indigenous artist? Is it created by an Indigenous-owned company? And then, it has different levels to show the levels of authenticity. He spends 2-3 years designing the program and launch it, and the whole economics of Indigenous artwork is now starting to shift because of it. So here we go, I talked about cultural genocide, whose roots go right here. Here we have an individual, I told you a bit about his life, right? And he goes on a trajectory, right, directly rejecting and pushing back and against that effort and taking it on a new path. Another, and this will be the last, another individual. Some similarities and differences in life experience. Grew up here on the island in one of the nations. Very capable, charismatic, popular athlete, very talented, suffered abuse in the sports world, sexual abuse, creates a lot of challenge and journey in life, has suicide, touches life of one of his parents. This is somebody, though, who has the capacity, could do anything he wants to do. Could be a leader, a politician, whatever, very talented. In searching through and going through those experiences, he focuses on one thing and decides the focus has to be on Indigenous children. Because what most people don't realize, though, this is in the newspapers every day, is that in effect we're reproducing many of the effects of the residential schools through the child welfare system now, which is, so in British Columbia we have a child welfare crisis. Thousands of children removed from their homes, 60% of those are Indigenous who are in the child protection system. And that, just like the 60s, we had the residential schools, we had this so-called 60s scoop, which had some in the 50s and some in the 70s and so forth, where children would adopted out and removed. Now, effectively, all of this is, right, cultural separation, cultural cutting off, right? It is part of that process of ensuring, right, that first prong of cultural genocide. Well, now it's the government through the child protection system that's doing it. Because then we have experts, many experts here they're removed and they're cut off from their cultural. And we know from every academic study, all the literature, everything, that the key to success for an Indigenous child is connectedness to culture and identity. That is established in every way possible. So this individual, with all of that experiences he had, and able to do anything he wished as he came through that, decided to become a social worker, and then to found, and I found, one of the most successful agencies, Indigenous run, using Indigenous culturally appropriate means to take control of the children in care in a number of nations and start that process of ensuring that they remain culturally connected and returned to family and community. And this is going on in different parts of the province, and I see people here, many people who are working on that same endeavor. But this individual, right, it's another example. It's that pushback, right, and that demonstration that this effort at genocide failed, right? It had great harm, but it failed, and it's these Indigenous people showing the way. Now, I end with talking about those two individuals, because you should just contrast it to where I started, selfishly talking about myself. Because myself and those two individuals were all the same age, right? See how vastly different circumstances we grew up in, right? Vastly different opportunities, vastly different experience, right? But that real work of those two individuals and thousands like that is really at the heart of the hope of this work of reconciliation that we're all challenged with. So I really wanted to, really contrast that, from where we were at the beginning of the evening. So I've talked way over my time. So thank you, and I'll stop there. Thanks. So are there a few questions or comments folks want to make? Yeah. They want the mic. We'll just take maybe 3 or 4 questions. I know it's been a long evening. Yeah.
I'm just curious about how the Baha'i faith has affected...
Maybe turn it on.
It is on? Okay. I'm curious about how the Baha'i faith, how being a Baha'i has affected your work. Are there any spiritual teachings or social teachings that have had an effect?
Well, I mean, like any endeavor, we're all shaped by our own personal, experiences and, upbringings and so forth. I would just say 2 things in relation to that. I mean, one is obviously, for those of you who know anything about the Baha'i faith, the social justice element of it, in particular the aspect of, from a Baha'i perspective, the fundamental challenge facing humanity is to create cohesion and harmony between distinct groups of humanity. That creating that fundamental unity that can honor and respect the diversity between them is the challenge that humanity has to face up to, that challenge of interconnectedness. And it is, so there is a natural correlation to the challenge of reconciliation. I mean, if you look in Canada, right, we have long framed that challenge as between the English and the French, which we're all tired of hearing about and have been tired of hearing about for a long time, but that's been the challenge, right? But now the real challenge, of course, that Canada has to come to create that cohesive society is this one that we've been talking about tonight. So, there's at the heart of the Baha'i teachings around unity is this natural correlation to reconciliation. More so, there's a bit of a historical connection between the Baha'i community in that by the 1970s, as it happens, about half the Baha'i community was Indigenous in Canada and had a great influence on the Baha'i community. And certainly that affected me as well. And related to that, there was a period of time in the 50s and 60s where, in effect, the head of the Baha'i community, the most prominent Baha'i in the world, was actually a Canadian woman of English descent, But she decided for those 10 or 15 years where she was the most prominent Baha'i in the world, she visited just about every Native community across this country and across the Americas, South America as well, showing the significance of Indigenous people. So that certainly was an influence, that historical element as well as pivotal. So those are a few of the things that sort of inspired me or motivated me around it. Yeah. Other questions?
Just a comment. It is very heartwarming to hear you say that there is a shift that is it on? Yeah. That a shift has been taking shape from the adversarial system of the court approach to the community-based humans that do not have to consider those ramifications of formality and legal system and adversarial approach to figuring out ways that the community can address. So I consider that a major shift and very heartwarming.
Yeah, I mean, this is the 2 minutes of my talk that I skipped, which I'll say, which is at the end of that legal story, I was going to say, you should remind yourselves, however, of what occurred in the United States with the civil rights movement. And it's not a perfect analogy, there's differences, but similar. From around the 1920s till 1952, the courts were a central vehicle for desegregation of African Americans and white Americans in the United States. And then 1952 to 54 is the litigation around the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which ends segregation. Well, what happens from then until the 1963 is the 10 years of most intense civil disturbance, civil action, March on Washington. Like, it is after that when the response is not sufficient in the community halls and in the hallways and in people's hearts and in people's minds, right? That there was an acceleration of unrest, of action, direct action on the ground. And so the challenge that we face, I think it's a fair analogy to say, is with the legal process, yeah, it's not over, people will still use it, but we know the parameters, we know the fundamental outcomes, it's all the interior designing that still has to go on. With that over, right, either we embrace it and actively do it, or we will make it more painful, right? And this is not a 10-year process, it's not a 20-year process, right? Turn on your television and look at police in the United States and the issues that we see for the last, it takes generations, but still, it's about how painful and how harmful versus how constructive and dynamic we will make it. That's the challenge of this moment. With the courts having done their bit, and we know their limitations, we have to embrace it in audacious ways, or it will be very painful. We'll take maybe 3 more, and then we'll end. Yeah, here, and then here, and then here.
On a hopeful note, an example of a good start and a good effort happened in Oak Bay last summer. The Indigenous peoples came and they had, for the first time in 100 years, an official welcoming ceremony for the mayor and council. And I think one of the MPs was part of that too. So they had the traditional canoe came into Willows Beach area, and they shared talks and Indigenous dancing, and it was really felt hopeful, like a beginning, of understanding traditions and each other.
And there's more and more of that occurring. I should say we have the first ever Indigenous city councillor from Nanaimo here tonight. Bill, he was elected last year? No, a year and a half ago?
Yes, November of 2014.
November 2014. And I think like, we've never had an Indigenous member of the legislature in here. I guess the first would be Melanie Mark, who's running right now in a by-election in, what's the riding? It's the downtown east side, yeah, of Vancouver. If she were elected in the next month, she would be the first. I actually think, Bill, you may be you're one of the first on the island Indigenous city politicians. This is after he spent 13 years on his, 13 years? Yeah. On his band council with the Nanaimo First Nation government. So that was quite a historic moment. And I should say, there was some racist incidents early in the campaign with his signs. There was a nice picture of There was a picture of everybody's sign, the big signs on a street corner, and they're all there for all the candidates. And one of them was destroyed and spray painted and had stuff on it that was derogatory, and it was, of course, his. And but it was dealt with early in the campaign, and I don't think it ever came up again.
Just quickly add on that story, Roshan. It happened middle of the night. One of my signs had, there's the usual Facebook and this and that type of racist comments. And Roshan, before I comment, I'd like to first of all acknowledge I'm a guest here this evening in your community, and on behalf of First Nations people and my partner Sean, we're so very fortunate to have Roshan as a friend and his beautiful family here, because it gives you the strength and courage that we can all make a difference as one. So I've been fortunate to have Roshan as a friend. He gives us lots of guidance and support, but also realize we all can live amongst each other as one. So I think Roshan is making a difference, and he makes your community, he makes me proud to be a friend, but also he should make your community proud, because he's making a difference out there, not just in Victoria and the island, but across the country and globally. So very fortunate to have Roshan there with his heart and his mind. He has, like our First Nations teach, good heart, good mind. So I guess it is universal, not just First Nations. But just to finish up on that, and don't worry, Roshan, I'll give this mic up in a minute. I'm starting my back to some people, but just
all politicians are the same.
First of all, just is in regards to the sign. In all seriousness, no, it was really heart wrenching. I remember the morning it happened. I went to first thing I went down to the gym, just had a hard spin on the bike, and I was really upset. And I phoned Roshan and really upset about the graffiti and the ugly stuff happening. It was starting to heat up for a bit, and the first thing I said, I'm gonna have my team out there replace that sign right now. We're gonna get on it right now. Phone the construction guys doing my campaign. So anyways, nevertheless, Roshan thinks, and he goes, no, let's leave it for a bit. And lo and behold, we left it up for the whole campaign, because it made, I'm really pleased we did it. It took Roshan's guidance and let people reflect. And this is how we really want to be, because it was at a key intersection in Nanaimo, where with a prominent, higher income type neighborhood. And it was, we kept it up during the whole campaign, and everyone had to go through there and see, are we really about that? And it was pleased. And then I don't do Facebook, but the comments switched and reversed and saying we're not about that. So it wasn't about a pity bill, but I want to be more reflective of society, how we don't want to be, sort of totally in conjunction of this evening's conversation. So, and that happened numerous times, and we just took the high road and smile, march on, and make a difference like this conversation tonight, and we can all be in reconciliation together. Thank you, Roshan, for mentioning that, and thank you for the time this evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Haichka, Haisepka.
We'll take two last comments, one here and then one there, and then three last comments, and then we'll end the evening.
Maybe what I'm going to say is a bit controversial. I just finished working on a book of the Knights of Baha'u'llah, Gail and Jamie Bond, who were the first Baha'is to go to the far north, above the Arctic Circle. They were 10 years in Arctic Bay, and then was connected to the north all the rest of their lives. And of course, he was an anthropologist. A lot of his work was looking at the Inuit and looking at how they transformed in 10 short years from a very strong, independent, nomadic tribe to a completely dependent and alcohol-driven, settled community. And he saw that vast cultural change and what it did to the people and what it did to their identity. And I just wanted to say that, out of that, it came a sense that it's not only the First Nations culture, because and what is real culture? When you look at real culture, it discusses it expresses a traditional way of life, and that traditional way of life, particularly for those Inuit people, was lost. Any Inuit person, you would ask them, do you want to go back to the nomadic life where your average lifespan is 33 years, where, you don't have grave sites there, you just buried it, you just left on the ice. Nobody wanted to go back to that traditional life. Yet people were trying to recreate it and romanticize it. And it seemed that it was like trying to go backwards when backwards wasn't a place to go to. The point that I wanted to make is, what is it that we can do really culturally? And I think we have to change in terms of our culture too. The idea of land and land ownership, they didn't have that. They lived on the land. They didn't own the land, or they didn't have the land. They have no concept at that time of then. And then, of course, all that was taken over by the people that went up north and got mines going and everything. So my question is how do we move forward instead of trying to recreate a lifestyle or romanticize a lifestyle that really is not possible to do? And how do we change our culture to come up with a new culture of both of us working together as one united family?
Yeah, I would just say two things. I mean, there's lots of complex issues there, and we can talk for a long time, but I think we have to be very careful in two ways. Number one, when we talk about culture, if our minds are going to something static, right, something that's not dynamic, then we're misunderstanding the notion of culture itself. Like, even the use of the term traditional does not mean unchanging. Does not mean, I'm talking about generally, generic across all societies, right? The notion of culture and tradition as things that are fixed. All human societies, at all times in human history, adapt and change their ways of life and modes of doing things in ways that are responsive and dynamic to the shifting contexts that are, and at the same time true to various core distinct elements of who they are and their orientation to the world and to their ways of life. And so we have to be very careful when we talk about these things. It's not that there was a way this way, then something interrupted it, and the discussion is about going back. No, the discussion is about Indigenous people expressing and other people expressing their distinctive worldviews and ways of life in ways that, are responsive to the conditions and contexts that we find in today. That's like the stories I was telling you when we talk about cultural connectedness for children, and how every study shows that cultural connectedness is sense. It's not, we're not talking about being connected to, some, particular circumstances and type of life pattern, right? But we're talking about understanding a worldview, a sense of self, a language, a symbology, modes of expression that are dynamic and also change, just like our language changes, our symbology changes. So we have to be very careful with these associating culture with a fixed time, like to give a Baha'i example, right? Because of what you were, you're referring to. Right at the time I mentioned this, prominent Baha'i woman who traveled to Indigenous communities all over. She wrote a letter to Indigenous peoples across the Americas in 1969. It's a 30-page letter that was distributed in their languages and so forth. And the reason I emphasize 1969 is that was the year of Pierre Trudeau's white paper, poorly named white paper, that was, was really an essential prong aimed at the complete assimilation and destruction of Indigenous culture. And it's very interesting because the woman I'm referring to, her family home is 2 homes down from Pierre Elliott Trudeau's home on Peel Street, on Pine Street in Montreal. But the letter she wrote in 1969, the opening paragraphs are praise for Indigenous cultures and languages and accomplishments and achievements in civilizations, and how essential they are, to your point, to interact with and engage in creating new modes and influencing humanity as a whole as we come together to create new patterns, and apology for what her descendants had done to theirs. So it's that dynamic that I think is pivotal to explore as well. Should we have the last two comments and then we'll call it a night? I think there's one here first and then last.
I was just reflecting when you were talking about the stages of any social movement, whether it's women or environment, or as a Jew, the Jewish movement to deal with anti-Semitism. And you were talking about the first stage is ignoring. And that happened for a long time. That worked quite well in terms of the powers that be. And this is a power struggle. I don't think this is a moral imperative. In fact, the moral imperative for most of the movements haven't really had much power, and they're a diversion in some way. So the second stage is ridicule. To describe the weak in some way. We see it with the homeless now, and we've seen it with First Nations, how we describe them. The next stage is attack. And I think that's a good thing, that the racism is out in the open. The attack means that you're really making an impact. I'm glad there's somebody who is a politician. And my question is, if we focus on power, now that we have a First Nations Solicitor General, there was a First Nation MLA, by the way, in the Barrett government. And I just wondered to what degree the First Nations voting increased and having a position of power in the cabinet, how much that will make a difference, including the court cases, which I support.
So there's a few Indigenous in the cabinet, Hunter Tutus in the cabinet as well, and Jody Wilson-Raybould, you were referring to, was the regional chief out here and is the Minister for Justice now. I haven't talked about the theme of power, but clearly, look, the other way to give the legal narrative, which is, consistent with the whole question about, for example, the Indigenous peoples turning to the courts the way that they did, is fundamentally to see whether the courts were going to play a constructive role in balancing or shifting power in some way that would then have an impact on political, social, and economic efforts to drive the change on a broader sphere. And I have to tell you, the Tsilhqot'in case went through. So, look, early on, there wasn't much hope. Then there was the repatriation of the Constitution and the inclusion of Section 35. Let's be crystal clear. Section 35 was intended to be a total sham. I was told by so on the night before the Trudeau government agreed to inclusion of Section 35, I was told by one of the attorney generals at the time, that all the provincial attorney generals and deputy attorney generals and Jean Chrétien, who was the federal attorney general, were all on the phone together, and they all got on the phone and they said, okay, what are we going to do about this Section 35 Aboriginal thing? And they all had legal opinions, and they all agreed that it was completely empty and meaningless. And he told me that we sat on the phone and we said to each other, he wouldn't say which one of them said it, we fooled the Indians once again. So let's be clear, it was a sham, right? And of course there was the Constitutional Express that Aboriginal people took across the country, many to try to stop any inclusion in the Constitution of it, on the notion that it would inherently limit what was inherent. But nonetheless, Indigenous people took it and filled it, and it became filled in ways that no Canadian government of any order expected. The court, the Supreme Court of Canada, in quiet, private discussions, has been very transparent about what they were trying to do. So, for example, a recent meeting privately with 3 justices, they basically said, similar to what you said, they said to some prominent Indigenous representatives, they said, look, we've done everything we can in our power to shift the power, right? Like we have gone to the wall, was the exact words one of the justices said, and they're very explicitly trying to do what you're saying. We're trying to level the power so political, social, economic processes can get on with that struggle playing itself out. So that is all part of the narrative that's there, and that's crucial underpinnings to it. Last comment?
I can be quick on this. You mentioned that the school curriculums are being adapted now to talk about this to children and students. But speaking as an adult who grew up like you with very little contact or knowledge of this subject, what would you consider an essential reading list for somebody wanting to catch up to this story? And is it being created? Are these materials being created?
Oh yeah, there's probably people here. I would encourage you to speak to there's some people who could probably give you a very comprehensive reading list. I mean, you could start with just basic, widely accessible things, like specifically, I was talking about Truth and Reconciliation. I mean, you could, if you go to the publications of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that are on the website, easily accessible. They have a history, they have an accounting, they have video works. That'll give you that aspect of it. So that would be one, starting place, just that immediate window. And they're very accessible materials there as well. They've done a very good job in creating that knowledge. I could give you more after if you wanted in terms of a list. I should just say that we always have to remind ourselves, the residential school experience is greatly significant, fundamental. I mean, one of the most grievous wrongs in this narrative, but it is one of many. Right? It is one of many, and it is one that is central in many ways. But it is, if we think like about apartheid in South Africa, this is one expression of a whole system that has many, many expressions to it, and we have much, much more to learn about the real history and realities. And as you can see, we're heading into another inquiry about murdered and missing women, which effectively is going to be about the injustice of the justice system itself, right? And intersection with issues of gender and so forth and so on, but is going to reveal similar disturbing wrongs inherent in the system of justice itself in the history of the country. Like, there's many parameters of this, but I would start it somewhere just like that, and there's some excellent materials there. Yeah.
Are you doing it yourself? Have you done it?
Done. Oh, writing? Yeah, they're boring though. But if you give me your email, I'll send you some works. Not my own, but I'll send you some good stuff to read. I think we're wrapping up. Is it brief? Brief? Okay, last comment.
I was hoping that there would be some discussion of practical matters.
And I would like to make a suggestion. In the early 90s, there was a huge campaign to protect the area between Saanich and Sooke Basin. It took about 10 years. Huge number of individuals and organizations were involved, and that is now called the C2C Green Blue Belt. In discussion with Chief Plenis in Sooke about that issue, he said, well, one of the things that happened as a result of that protection of that area, and the motivation was to keep out urban sprawl and commercial logging, he said, we have also been excluded. They're excluded when we create a park. We manage the parks, we being the CRD and the municipalities. So my question is, would there be any value to inviting the First Nations back into these areas and having them involved in the management of those lands. Those lands are with the Water District lands, are 35,000 hectares. It's the third largest protected area in Vancouver Island, and it's not insignificant in area. What do you think?
Well, yes, absolutely. It's taking place in other parts of the province in various ways. But, fundamentally, we have been locked in on exactly those kinds of issues. Our way of approaching them has been far too passive and incremental and based out of fear and not understanding that we can really take bold steps to own the land and manage the land together in really meaningful and useful ways that'll be better for everybody. And we're at that moment because of that Tsilhqot'in stuff I described, that we really just need to embrace that in a bold way and do it. And it's mostly fear and lack of knowledge that holds it back at government level and on the ground. So yes, absolutely. And there's also other examples where it's a little further ahead than what you're describing here, but we still need to take some bold steps on that, and we should be doing it. And I think we'll end there. So thanks, everyone. Take care.